Three.
Good morning, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in with us. Appreciate all of you who are out there listening along as we continue our quest here through stewardship and trying to learn about how to be better stewards of the things that God has entrusted us with. As always, this morning with me is my fellow colleague, Michael Ray. Michael, how's everything in Somerset this morning?
I've been an esteemed colleague up to this point, so I don't know what I've did over the last week to lose my status, but we talk about that offline, but it's really upsetting.
Just a slight downgrade.
Deserved, I'm confident.
So as we've been going on with this, the important part that we want to make sure that we get across is what we're trying to do is tackle these ideas from a spiritual perspective. How can we be better? God's entrusted us with such great blessings, and we are well undeserving of all that we've been blessed with. So if we take an attitude of appreciation, of that we truly appreciate all that God has done for us, now how do we show that appreciation in how we care for these goods? And we've talked, so far as we've gotten into this, just a real quick recap for those of you that may be tuning in late. The first lesson we talked about is just the need for this study, how much of the Bible talks about the need for stewardship and the need for us to take care of these things, to stay away from greed, and to have a heart full of generosity. So we talked about that first. And then secondly, we talked about the idea of how we should view everything, that we are truly, a fiduciary or a power of attorney of God's money, that it's not our possessions. These are God's possessions. And what we do with God's money is very important. And the fact that there's going to be a final accounting. And so that all set the stage for our last few classes, which has been on truly looking at the budget. So how do we start? Well, the first thing you start is you got to have an accounting of what you got. So what do you have, and where are those resources being deployed? So that's where we're at, kind of today, is continuing to go through that. The first couple of things of the budget that we've looked at is how we start the budget. Your budget always should begin with what we're giving to kingdom goals. So first and foremost, off the top, our giving is very important. And we broke that down into both giving to the church and giving to others and need, and looked at that through the concepts of the gleaning in the Old Testament, as well as the blessings that we have in the New Testament, that God has told us that we've got enough that we work with our hands, that we can provide for ourselves, and to have enough to share with others. So that's important. And then we talked about how we should pay ourselves first, set aside savings, set aside emergency funds, provide for insurance. And that's kind of, the important part. Now, again, talking heads will tell you pay yourself first, but, God's kingdom goals get paid first. Secondly is us. So, which brings us to where we are today, right? That we're now on to the third leg of that stool. And Michael, why don't you introduce where we're going to be today?
Sure. So, I think as you covered there, we every budget has to start with a certain amount of income, and just to as by way of review, this is based on the median family in the state of Kentucky, which is a $50,000 household, and so this is a $50,000 income household, and so your individual results will vary, no question, but we got some principles here that we think are important. And they're as you review this, or maybe you're thinking or have some feedback, so there's no way that someone with a $50,000 household is able to have a budget that looks like this. Well, as Mike and I noted, this budget is aspirational, right? This is an ideal look at someone who has been an exceptionally good steward of their things. And I also would note on here, and if you've studied this closely, this apparently is a household without children. There's no kids expenses on here, which would change the nature of some of these line items as well. But it is something that we're going through that we believe is realistic, and that is based on Bible principles. So, and we say that based on the verses that we've talked about before and that are on the screen. God tells us to know the condition of our flocks. And God tells us to count the cost when we build a tower. And maybe that Luke 14 verse, Mike, is most applicable to what we're talking about this morning, because we're not going to sit down and build a tower, but we may be sitting down to build a house. or certainly at least to purchase a house or a home. And as part of that parable, Jesus said, sit down first and see if you got the money to complete it. And so that's what we're going to undertake in our class today. Is when we look at this sizable chunk of our financial life about housing, how should the Christian view these expenses? And there's a number of, as you can see, there's a number of different buckets that we've allocated funds to here. Obviously, the mortgage or rent being a big part of that. We know that there are phone and utility expenses. House has maintenance. There's other things that would go into that into this larger bucket of housing. But this is for almost everyone. This is one of the larger, if not the largest, line item on the budget. And many people tell you to start here when you're budgeting. I think hopefully we've seen that God's priorities are a little different, and we're going to tackle these things in a certain order. But after we have given to kingdom goals, and after we have prudently saved for replacement of things that we're going to need, and save for our future, that God has blessed us with abundance, and we're able to do that, then we can really sit down and analyze what should the size of this bucket be. So I'm going to make one more note here, Mike, and I'm going to turn it over. Is you might be saying, well, there's things that aren't in this number. There are things that have to do with my housing expenses that aren't in this bucket, and we agree. But we think more accurately, some of those expenses might be categorized as entertainment expenses. Streaming and television, those are optional line items. And so I just think that's important to remember, is what's the difference between what's truly housing and what's entertainment. Housing is mortgage, property taxes, phone, utilities, and phone could probably is somewhat questionable, but I mean, that is kind of a life necessity and fits most comfortably in this bucket. And insurance, all those things, those I think comfortably fit into this pretty sizable bucket, which for this family is a significant chunk of their monthly income. I mean, almost a quarter, rough numbers, of their monthly income is allocated to this bucket. Now, that's not all mortgage, but in the utilities and repairs and insurance and everything that would go into housing is roughly a quarter of their total expenses. And so, this part of our life deserves some attention.
Right. And I just want to go on record here that I love that the accountant says that phones are optional. He's a little tighter with the pencil than I am.
I don't think that I said that, but I'll let it go.
But in all honesty, when we look at this, this is roughly 25% of the gross number. But more realistically, because nobody lives on gross, this is 35% of the net number. So this is by far the largest item. And that's why most of your talking heads, your, financial gurus on the radio, will tell you that start with your housing. Well, the problem that we're going to see later with this as we dig into the math is, if you start here, this number can get a whole lot bigger. This number can be 40 or 50% of your net income, and you don't have any money left to do anything else. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, but a couple of things I want to make sure we hit on here. Some of these numbers, again, remember we're using averages, but if you live in a house that is older, that isn't maybe up to code, or maybe a fixer upper or something, your utilities may not be $150. Your utilities may be $200 or $225 until you get some things done. So that money's got to come out of somewhere. So that's why when we talk about streaming and movies and TV and some of this other stuff, those have to be treated as entertainment, because something's got to be cut. And if you've got to cut something, I think you're going to have a phone. You're going to have maintenance and repairs of the house. You have to have You got to pay the mortgage, you got to pay the insurance. These things right here that are on the screen that we're talking about are non-negotiables. These are going to have to be paid every month. It's the other things that, it may be, and please don't misunderstand us here, it may be boring to watch the 4 channels. Is it 4 or 5, with KET? Maybe that's not, what you want out of your lifestyle, and that's boring and whatever. But that's just where we're at. If that's what the budget dictates. And I would have a difficult time in accounting when the master shows back up to talk about his talents, to say, I didn't have any money to give to the local church because Netflix, right? I mean, that's a very, I think, difficult conversation to have with God about, I've entrusted you with all of this and you couldn't give because of Netflix or, whatever. And I'm not picking on Netflix, just, whatever that television, cable, there are things that from time to time because of our, and I'll just say it this way, because of our first world mentality, we think that, cable TV, satellite TV, streaming services are a, basic human necessity. And they're just not. Like, we've got to be honest with this. That's not a basic human necessity. Air conditioning, indoor plumbing. Yes, I will go all in with you on basic human necessities. Binge watching Friends for the 15th time. I can't tell you, you have to have that. So when we talk about this, I think that's important. There's one other line item here too. If you're not budgeting and accruing and planning for maintenance or repairs, you are setting yourself up to fail. And the bigger the house that you have, the more that can go wrong. And, what you find out is, in a certain, you've got to replace things that are consistent with that house. So, you can't, if you have a $200,000 house, you can't put things in the $200,000 house that, don't fit because they were made for a $50,000 house, for example. So you've got to understand what it's going to cost to replace, like the HVAC unit. If you've got a house that is 1,000 square feet, you need one size of an HVAC unit. But if you have a house that is 2,500 square feet, you need twice the size of an HVAC unit, which is twice the money. So we've got to understand that they're going to come with some bigger expenses the bigger the house you have. So that's got to factor into, that top line of what can I afford to pay in a mortgage payment, because I've got to know I've got some of these other expenses that not may happen, are going to happen. The beauty of home ownership, the difference between that and renting is when something breaks, there's nobody to call except for somebody that's going to bring you a bill. And if your toilet's clogged up and you can't fix that, you can call a plumber and they're going to hand you a bill. If whatever goes wrong, you're responsible for. And you've got to plan for that. If you don't plan for that, then it makes homeownership very, very difficult.
And there's definitely some overlap between that maintenance and repair line and the savings line that we talked about in our last class. That we are probably in that savings bucket accruing for some of those larger things, right? Or at least hopefully we are. We've been thoughtful about that for the roof, for the HVAC. This line item is kind of, in my mind, more of the monthly nagging repairs that have to be done. You got to go buy some parts to fix the toilet. And even I can do that. There's a certain level of maintenance that even the most ill-equipped can handle. So there, again, we're definitely accruing for those larger things, but we know that part of owning a home are the nagging monthly expenses, and that's kind of what this is intended to cover.
And that could be other things, like even more basic than that, like light bulbs.
Sure.
There's dumb things that always get us every month, but this is the utopian budget here, where we're trying not to get surprised, right? That's the goal here. Is if we've got an accrual for everything, then we don't get surprised. But here's the funny thing about said budget. There's also a line item for other, because we anticipate getting surprised. Like from time to time, look, we just didn't anticipate this and it happened, or there's not enough money in the maintenance and repairs, or something's not exactly maintenance or repairs. It's, you're going to pay somebody to come and take out a tree. And, hey, that's in the other bucket. So I didn't mean to cut you off, Michael, just kind of a thought there.
No, you're going where I was going, is there's this other bucket that we don't necessarily allocate a budget number to, but we know that other things happen. We know that you buy a new piece of furniture. There are things that go into into housing that don't neatly fit into those buckets, and so we want to allocate for those as we go along. And you can see during this fictional month, this family did have $150 of those other expenses. They bought a couple of lamps or whatever they did, that we want to capture and be able to look at over time, but may not fit neatly into any of the buckets. The other thing I'd note about the top line, which is the largest line, the mortgage and the rent line, is because we know that different people have different housing situations. If you are a homeowner, that line includes property taxes. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. If you're a renter, obviously we're just talking about your monthly lease payment. In either case, there's some level of insurance that you're going to need to carry, and this is really based on some home ownership insurance level. But again, for the sake of this fictional budget, this is a family that has a mortgage, and we'll talk in a little more detail about what that mortgage might look like.
Right. And if you're renting, you can play with those two numbers together, right? So if your renter's insurance is $25 a month, then
Correct.
you can afford an extra $75 on the rent payment because you're capturing some of those other things in there.
Correct.
Part of the reason why renter's insurance is so cheap, and just to, I don't mean to turn this into a property and casualty class, but just real quick, part of the reason why renter's insurance is very inexpensive is that all it covers is your stuff. The property owner is covering the building and covering, the replacement of the building, which is the biggest cost. But your stuff that's inside your apartment or your townhouse is all you're covering on your renter's policy. So they're just going to replace your clothes and all of that, those types of things. So that's a lot less expensive. Essentially, your part of your rent payment is going to cover insuring the cost of the building. So that number's still there. It's still being paid, but you're just paying it out of a different bucket. But it's still the same net money. It's just who's paying what in that scenario.
So, Mike, I'd like to take a look at this again, this fictional budget for this family, this good steward family. And you might be asking the question, well, are these numbers, are they reasonable? Is that a reasonable mortgage payment? Is that a reasonable insurance number? So this is something that you can find on many third-party websites. This is stolen from I can't remember, bankrate.com or some similar site. And so how do we get to the mortgage number that we came to? I would have you remember, I'm going to jump back for just a minute. Remember that we talked about this mortgage number included our mortgage payment plus property taxes at $750, and then $100 for insurance. Well, in this fictional example, you'll see that our principal and interest plus our property taxes is about $750, and our homeowner's insurance is about another $100, total of $850. So this example mirrors very well our fictional family. And so what is that based on? Well, that is based on a $150,000 home that this good steward was able to put 10% down on a 30-year mortgage at rates close to today's rates. So I think there are great tools out there, and this would help us come to that point. There are great tools out there that when we put our budget together and we get our give bucket and our save bucket, and we got our non-negotiable bucket, and we know what our net income is, that we can come and say, okay, here are my income numbers. We know what I know based on this great little sheet here what I can afford for mortgage and what I can afford for insurance. So what does that mean in terms of a home, and have some idea of what that home value is. I know this is we're way into the practical rather than the spiritual. We'll certainly get there. Why is this expenditure worthwhile in God's sight? But I do think that it's just good to be aware that there are many good tools out there to help us handle this part of our budget and understand how these numbers are calculated and what they mean.
So I want to piggyback on that too. So it is very, very important to educate yourself and find these tools, because as we're going to see in just a minute, if you walk into the bank, they're going to use different tools. So, their tools are going to be very different because, their goals are very different than your goals. So we've got to understand that. But here's the other thing, and I want to stay here for just a minute, is we are talking about median income in the state of Kentucky. So if you're listening to this and you live in New York City, no, $150,000 home is not reasonable in Manhattan. Okay, it's just not. We know what property values are, but also your median income is probably not 50 grand in Manhattan either. So I don't want someone to kind of get away or poo-poo like, well, nobody can afford to live in a $150,000 house. In almost every county in Kentucky, I mean, I'd say even in Jefferson County, which is probably our most expensive county to live in, you can find a home for $150,000. You can find a good place to live that you would be comfortable with at $150,000. Now, will it have all the amenities of a $300,000 house? No, no, it's not. But it's also not going to be, a shanty in the woods, and I think sometimes we've got to understand from an income standpoint, this is what I can afford. And if I try to stretch, then I'm going to have to sacrifice something else. So this is why this goal comes third on our list. And you can get on places like Zillow, Realtor.com, and put in an area and say, all right, I want to live in Pulaski County, or I want to live in Boyle County because that's where my job is. And what are the ones that are 150,000 and under? Because again, this is a budget. You can come in under. Where can I live? And you'll find plenty of houses there. Again, this doesn't work in LA. This doesn't work in New York City. But you've got to understand where we're talking about and where we're living. And I assure you, there are plenty of homes available at this price point here. And today, just because I work at a bank, Michael's high on the interest rate at 3.75. Okay. Today you can do that for between 3 and 3.15. I just got mortgage rates a little bit ago. We get them every morning, but you're 3 to 3.15, assuming you've got good credit. Now, if you've got bad credit, there's some extra points, but that's a whole other story. But it's important that we understand the difference between wants and needs, that we understand the difference between what we can afford and what we can't. This is how people get in trouble. This is exactly how people get in trouble is our next slide. So Michael, tell our friends if they walk into Friendly Bank ABC, what the mortgage lender who is just there to help is going to tell them.
So, and we chose this next example for exactly that reason, Mike, is that, the godly, the stewardship mindset takes that giving bucket and that saving bucket and allocates those funds and says, okay, here is, from a stewardship perspective, this is what's reasonable in our budget. And it relies on some really old fashioned and out of favor things like thrift and saving and reasonableness, right? But that is not the model that most people use, unfortunately, when they go about how to look at a mortgage or how to look at a home. That instead, the mindset is, well, what's the maximum amount that I can? What's the biggest house that I can afford to buy? And afford is a difficult concept, because if you type in the words maximum mortgage into an internet search function, you will find many sites that'll tell you, based on your income, what is your maximum mortgage. And so, for the sake of this example, I plugged in on one of these sites. I plugged in our fictional family with their $4,150 of monthly income, and their monthly debt. We'll talk about that later. They got a $250 car payment, and their monthly property taxes and insurance. And based on those numbers, this site, and as Mike would say, mortgage lenders at almost any bank would tell you, well, hey, where rates are today, you can afford a mortgage up to $215,000. And hey, if you add that to your $15,000 down payment that we already talked about, we can put you in a $230,000 home. And all of a sudden you go to Zillow and you look at the $230,000 homes compared to the $150,000 homes. And you know what? They're nicer. The neighborhoods are a little better. The yards are a little bigger. The appliances are a little nicer. They are. It's the nature of why that home costs more. And so, hey, if the mortgage lender is telling me that I can afford a $230,000 home, again, $215,000 mortgage plus our down payment, then he understands finances. He knows that I can afford that. And then all of a sudden, instead of our mortgage, property taxes, and insurance coming to $850, they're at $1,150. And that's the difference between those two examples. So it's $300 a month. Well, where's that $300 going to come from? Unfortunately, in most instances, if you go back to look at our budget, it comes out of the giving and saving buckets that we sacrifice what we're saving to replace and for retirement goals, or we sacrifice kingdom purposes for those appliances in that nicer part of town. And that's just a real practical, concrete example of how that happens. Is that if we went about this for this fictional family the way that Mike and I, the way that we believe is the right way to budget, we would end up in this $150,000 home. If we took those same income numbers and just went to the internet, we might end up in a $230,000 home. And the difference is how many widows and orphans we can help. The difference is how much that we can help poor families. The difference is how much we can put in our replacement fund for the roof and the HVAC unit. And really the difference is if we're not funding those other things, that when hard times come along, then all of a sudden we're in credit card debt or we're in home equity debt, and the snowball gets bigger. But it's this kind of first decision on housing that can cause that snowball to grow in either of those directions.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit in leading up to this, but there are some ratios that are out there, and they're pretty well known about. It's 35% of your gross income, and the bank's going to run you through those. Here's the issue with that. Again, I've got a little inside baseball because I work at a bank and I work right next to a mortgage lender who's a good friend of mine. So the inside baseball is most of these mortgages are government-backed mortgages. There's a company called Freddie Mac and another one called Fannie Mae that are government entities at this point that set these parameters. And when they look at your gross income, they apply these figures to them. What's not in that calculation? God, savings. No, that's in the calculation. They do not, under any circumstances, account for it. When they get to 35% of gross income, they're accounting for food and basic living expenses, but are not calculating, any giving or savings. Though, they'll deduct car payments and they'll deduct anything that shows up on a credit report to come to your debt to income ratio and then your housing to income ratio. All of those are based on things that show up on your credit report. But, the Lord's church is not going to show up on your credit report. Michael's the treasurer at Southside, and I don't know that he reports to any credit bureau what people contribute every month or every week, right? It's never going to show up there. It's not a credit obligation as your credit card bill or your car payment is. So from the world standpoint, you just don't do that. That's not part of it. From the world standpoint, only uber wealthy people can afford to give. So, once you get up to where you can pay cash for a house or, you're financing $1 million house or whatever, then you can give to charities. But average Joe should just be able to pay their bills. And especially in a consumer-driven, consumer-based society, a consumption-based society, they want us to consume. And so that's the world's picture of this. But again, we are not of the world, and we are just passing through. We're vacationing here. We're just sojourners. We're travelers. And our goals are not, I need to have the nicest house on the block or the nicest house in my socioeconomic circle or the nicest house at church. We need a house that is a capital asset used also for the purposes of kingdom goals. Like we've got to understand why we own the house. And that's got to be the most important thing, is that this is, what is our intent when we say, I want to own a home? And I think that leads us kind of to our next section here. But we've got to get away from, I'm owning it because it's pretty. And we need to get to the point of, what am I owning it for?
Yeah, homes are such a status, right? They're such in the modern world, consumption-based society that we're in, homes are a status symbol, and it's incredibly easy to fall into that trap. And I think the question that you ask is the right one, is why is this large line item, why is it a good use of God's resources? Is it a good use of God's resources? And that is the question that the Christian is forced to kind of wrestle with and answer. Is that, should this, even in our stewardship example, it was a significant part of their budget. We said, 25% of their gross income. So, is that a good use of God's resources? And if we think about it from that stewardship perspective, it changes a lot of those answers. It turns not into how much house can I afford, but how much of God's money am I comfortable spending on my housing? And that's a very different way to look at that question. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We've kind of dove into the practical. What's the difference between a stewardship mortgage versus a maximum mortgage? But we wanted to end with the spiritual, about the bigger spiritual question of, are these expenditures a good steward of God's resources? And we believe that they are, that it is reasonable to spend a portion of our budget on this large capital asset if we're doing it with kingdom intent. And how do we do that? And Mike, one of those ways that comes to mind is, are we using that capital asset for hospitality? Is this God's house? And so we'll talk about a few of these verses.
Let me throw one thing at you before we get in there. Would you explain in layman's terms what a capital asset is? Because I threw that out there also like a jerk instead of explaining it. So can you walk us through kind of the idea of the balance sheet and what a capital asset is?
So, I would think very simply that a capital asset is something that we own of value, that is going to retain or even grow in value over time, that we have invested a significant amount of money in, over the life of a mortgage. You're going to invest a significant amount of money in this thing that we own, that retains and grows in value. That it is an asset. It is something that is, from a net worth perspective, is a large part of what we own, that is going to retain some value. I probably did a poor job with that, but I wasn't prepared.
I figured accounting right off the top of your head. Sorry, I got to poke the accountant every once in a while. So we talk about a capital asset. Another term here is also a use asset. So, this is something that we own that, as Michael said, both is going to increase our value, but holds and retains value. So we have it, but we have it to use for a specific purpose. That compared to like a vehicle, which is not a capital asset, it's a depreciating asset. It has a useful life and then it's gone. You're constantly, unless you've done a better job than anybody I know, with a vehicle, there's a certain life expectancy. You get 200, 300,000 miles on a vehicle and it stops running. It doesn't work anymore. You've got to go get another one. So we spend most of our lives turning over vehicles. But a home, there are homes in Boyle County, not far from me, that have been around since the late 1800s. They've been maintained. They've, I'm sure had a bunch of improvements done to them, but they've been standing in the same place. I don't know many vehicles that have been around since the 1970s. Most of those are gone or they're classic cars. So when we talk about that, this is also the difference in and we're going to get to this more in the debt class, but I just want to throw this in here as important. The difference between debt and leverage, a capital asset is a leverage asset. So think about it this way. You buy a house for $150,000 and the average growth of equity in a home is about 3%. Home prices typically increase over long periods of time at about 3%. So as you're making mortgage payments, the balance that you owe goes down, but the value of your house also goes up. So you're creating equity that hopefully at the end of your 30-year mortgage, and again, I'm just going to use simple interest, right? So at the end of your 30-year mortgage, 3% at 30 years is 90%. Your $150,000 house should be worth just under $300,000. So you've paid not 150. You've paid 3 over 30 years. You've probably paid close to $300,000 in payments for a house that is now worth $300,000, but as it's appreciating. So it's appreciating at roughly the same rate of your interest. So that's leverage. You borrowed 150 to create a $300,000 asset in the future. Different from you borrow $30,000 to buy a car that when you have that note paid off in 5 years, that car is worth $2,000. See the difference in a capital use asset that's appreciating versus a depreciating asset. So sorry, I didn't mean to get too far off the rails there, but I think it's important to understand that it's not only a place where we're going to live, and it's not only just an investment, but there is a specific kingdom uses that we have for this home that also makes it worth it. So it works out as an investment and all this other stuff, but what are we using it for? When like at the bank, we build a branch, we're gonna do business in that branch. We have got the purposes of the bank that we're gonna do when we build a new office. When you purchase a home and you have kingdom goals, what are you gonna use that home for? And that brings us to hospitality. So hospitality is the one that jumps right off the page of, hey, if I've got a home, I can open said home, right? I can have people into the house. And Michael, when you think about hospitality, before we get to our verses, what do you think about, right off the top of your head when you think hospitality, when you hear that word?
Well, I think it's been drilled into my head through some years of Bible studies, is that that Greek word behind hospitality means lovers of strangers, and so that kind of pops into my head a little bit. That's really what the root of the word is. That there's a love for somebody else, and even if we don't have a great relationship with those people that or know them very well, that we're still willing to be hospitable. And the other thing is, I think you would say also that there are specific people in our past that their names or their faces pop into your head when you mention hospitality, because there are certain people who excel at this grace, who are extremely hospitable people, that their homes were, they were clearly God's home, right? And that's the key to this. I think the key to this whole idea is, if every asset is God's asset, if we truly believe that He owns everything, if every spending decision is a spiritual decision, then this is God's asset, right? For all the conversation that we're having about it's our capital asset, it's going to appreciate, and all that gobbledygook that you spit at us. The end of it is, it's really God's house. That I'm making the payments with the funds that God has blessed me with, so that He can have this asset. Now, if this is God's asset, if this is God's house, how are we going to use it? How would God have me use it for His purposes? And I think there are people's names that would come to mind that I won't mention publicly, but there are people's names that come to mind immediately that I think of. Their home was God's asset, and there was no question in my mind that they were using it as God would have them to use it, because they understood and they recognized that they were stewards of God's house, and God wanted them to use their capital asset for kingdom purposes. How could they encourage others? How can they have studies in their home? How could they have singings in their home? How could they have fellowship events in their home where we could grow closer together, that God's kingdom truly benefited because God owned that house?
Yeah, and I think there's I've been running trying to find this quote in my head, um, and I'm gonna butcher it, but the concept basically is that it's a house that doesn't have doors because it's free to all who come through. That's the way you treat it. That it's a place to come where you can find rest, you can find solace, you can find refreshing. And when I think when I look back to the New Testament and I think about Mary and Martha, for example, right? That Jesus, when things were rough, like that's where he went. He went and he spent time with them. Now there was teaching that was done there was encouraging that was done there, but there's also like that's where he found peace and rest and comfort with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And throughout my life, and I'm sure throughout your life too, that there are places like that we think of that we went for that hospitality, for that rest, for that comfort, for that refreshing, and those were places that when I think of hospitality, that's exactly what I think about. That's what I want is, if I can create that environment where people can come and unburden themselves, right? I think that's huge. The other thing, my hospitality commercial here is there are things that you can talk about on a couch, around a kitchen table, that nobody's ever going to feel comfortable about in a Bible class. You're just not. I mean, I've taught adult Bible classes for 20 years now, and I've never heard people just raise their hand and unburden difficult things, problems in their marriage, problems with their kids, problems with themselves spiritually in the middle of that setting. I have, however, sat on a couch next to somebody and they've unloaded when it was just us because the environment was comfortable, because there was trust there, because we created a space. And I don't know whether the couch is just more comfortable or if you have a cup of coffee in your hand, you're freer to speak. I don't know what that is. But I know when you have that comfort, you're able to unburden yourself in a whole different way. And I think that's the purpose of hospitality. Hospitality, and if you're watching this and you have some misguided conceptions on hospitality, hospitality is not about the food. Hospitality is not about whether or not your house is clean or you've hidden all the dirt and the kids' toys and you put out the fake house where it looks like nobody lives in it. That is not hospitality. Hospitality is about an open heart and time to talk and to grow closer together.
Yeah, I mean that the key word of that hospitality in the Greek is love. It's not about structure. It's not about provision. It's not about to your point. It's not about food. It's not about coffee, but it's about love. And are we willing to use God's assets to love on people? That's essentially what it is. And I want to talk about this first verse that we have noted here, 1 Peter 4, verse 9 says, show hospitality to one another without complaining. And I use that for a specific purpose, is that because the root Greek of hospitality is lover of strangers, I've even known of some Christians who said, well, that's not about people in the church. That's about bringing in people from the outside. And if they need a place to stay, you give them a place to stay. But it's not really about, having people in the local congregation to your home or feeding people at your home. That's a fellowship idea, but that's not really what hospitality is. I think 1 Peter 4, verse 9 would dispute that point a little bit, that even though the root word means lovers of strangers, Peter says to do it to one another, to people that aren't strangers, that we are to have that kind of love, that openness, that comfort level, to have people in our home, to show hospitality to people that we know without complaining, to create those environments, Mike, that you're talking about, where true connection and sharing and love can happen. Just a couple more verses here, unless you've got another point you want to make there. Romans 12:13, contribute to the needs of the saints. That would go into the giving bucket. Pursue hospitality, and those things are paralleled in that verse, which I think is interesting. Acts 2:46 gives us a practical example of that. Remember, these early Christians, every day they gathered together by common consent in the temple courts, breaking bread from house to house, sharing their food with glad and humble hearts. From house to house, they were breaking bread, and that's not in a Lord's Supper sense. That just means that they were sharing food with one another. From house to house, they were open. God's homes in that area were open to this idea of hospitality. We know that in Matthew's gospel and Jesus' example of the final judgment, when the righteous come to him and said, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And he will say to him, I tell you the truth, as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. Like, how can we, God, how can we show that we're willing to feed you, or got to do it to one of my brethren? Should not surprise us that one of the qualifications for an elder in the book of Titus is that the elder must be hospitable, devoted to what is good. This is part of what God expects from the leaders of his people, is that they have open homes. In Hebrews 13 verse 2, don't neglect hospitality, because through it some have entertained angels without knowing it. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? So anyway, is home ownership a stewardship? Is it a godly use of resources? I think these verses would indicate that it is. That, again, can you spend too much of your budget on housing? Yes, for sure. You can put yourself in a bad spot. But is it reasonable to spend God's money on a house that God can use 100%?
Yeah, and the idea of hospitality here, I mean, this is a basic tenement. The next verse in Acts 2:46, verse 47 says, and the church grew.
Yes.
This is part of the growth of the church. There's all kinds of books written out there about, how to grow your church and whatnot. But at the end of the day, the scriptural pattern for it is you love people and you lead them to Jesus. That's how this works. And there are people that are far more willing to open up to you inside the house and visit with you and build a relationship with you than are going to walk through the doors of the church, regardless of what your sign says or what fancy marketing material you're using.
Amen. And just the opportunity to love on people, and how you gonna where's the right environment to do that, where you really got time to connect and to share and to hash out differences. What's the right environment to do that? It is very likely don't have the time or the opportunity or the venue to do it at the local meeting place, right? Now, perhaps you can schedule time to do it there, but just it's more comfortably done in a private environment. It's hard to do at the coffee shop. It's hard to do at the workplace. It's hard to do at McDonald's, but you bring somebody into your home, you can have those kind of kingdom conversations that can stretch as long as you need them to stretch. I've had to kick you out of of these kind of conversations and vice versa, I might add. But these kind of conversations that start with hospitality and go into kingdom purposes, those meaningful conversations are the ones that stretch for hours, and that's really the only venue that can accommodate that kind of thing. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was on the same page that, we've, I'm pretty sure that over our 17-year history here, we've kicked each other out of every home that we've lived in. Same story. So two anecdotal stories on hospitality that are just, every time I think about this, there's two stories that I think of. One involves Michael and some other friends. So when we were all first married around the same time. We didn't know each other at the time, but Diane and I and Michael and Tara got married a week apart in 2003. And fast forward a year later, we're all going to church at the same place. And that summer, there's, two other couples that recently gotten married and some friends that were there. And so we spent the next year, at least 1 or 2 days a week in each other's houses, just spending time together, eating together, talking. planning our lives, figuring out what all we didn't know. If not for that, two of us aren't sitting here today. And our relationships that have built over time and all we've been through really came out of that hospitality that we all, and listen, all of us at that stage of our life, we're broke, we're just starting out, had no idea how to be married, and we're just married. And, we were able to lean on each other. Our kids and this group of friends, our kids are, months apart and being born. We all became parents at the same time. But those times together and that hospitality, that's what brings us closer. And this is, a long friendships. We spent that next year together, and then almost immediately after that, we scattered to the corners of Kentucky and moved on. But we've been able to maintain those friendships because of that. So that's anecdote one, that this is really important. Anecdote two is I was in a gospel meeting, and it's not important where I was, not important the church. But one night of that meeting, it's typical when you're the meeting preacher, people have you in their house to eat, right? And it's always an experience because they invite other people over, you get to know people. That's a great experience. On one of the nights of the meeting, this lady had us into her apartment, and it was a studio apartment. It was me and Diane, the preacher that was there, and three other couples in a 800 square foot studio apartment. There weren't really tables. There was like a 2-person kitchen table, but one of the couples sat on her bed and ate. Another couple stood on the counter and ate. And she, fried fish and cooked for us. And we laughed and we joked and we had a fabulous time. And I've never, ever forgot her because she didn't think anything about she couldn't do this. I mean, she's in a little bitty apartment, but she wanted to show hospitality, and it was important to her to have people in her home and to create that environment. And I've known myself, I've been in this awful state where I thought I either don't have the room or don't have the resources or don't have the stuff. Like, I'm not the person to be hospitable during gospel meeting week or whatever other event, because I don't think I've got the right configuration. And I think about this woman and what she did. And I think about, how many of us talk ourselves out of being hospitable because we, think we don't have enough or the right food, or our house isn't clean enough, or our house isn't big enough, or our stuff isn't nice enough, or whatever myriad of nonsense that we talk ourselves into. I go back to that meeting in that night and think, she truly didn't care about any of that nonsense. She was worried about being hospitable, and that'll make an impression on me the rest of my life. So the important part, and I said that a little while ago, but the important part is not the meal, it's not the event, it's not any of that. The important part is people spending time together, talking and sharing their lives. That's what hospitality is. Forget the other stuff. That's just a side note. That's the sideshow.
Yeah, that is using what God blessed her with to bless somebody else. That's the core of what we're talking about. And because of that, yeah, it's a valuable use of God's resources. Are there biblical examples? Yes. Here's just one. Abraham. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. You may be familiar with that story, but Abraham was incredibly hospitable. Sorry about that. Abraham was incredibly hospitable, not knowing who these people were. And when Hebrews 13:2 says some have entertained angels unaware, I think that maybe the reference is to this account of Abraham, because these people that he didn't know in the heat of the day, he immediately gave them a place to stay and an opportunity to wash themselves, and prepared the best of what he had for them. And so that Genesis 18 example is a great one of how we can use our homes and our resources for God. And he was hospitable. That's genuinely loving of a stranger. One other thing, Mike, and I know we're short on time. One more thing that how can we use God's asset for God's purposes? And that's to raise God's children. Can we have an environment where one of the most, in my judgment, one of the most important things God has given us stewardship of, souls. Like, God has given us stewardship of souls. Like, contemplate that concept. that these souls that God has given us stewardship of, if our home, if that spend of God's money on a home allows us to raise God's children, I think that's a good use of resources. Because if the Lord doesn't build the house, then those who build it work in vain, Psalm 127, and children are a gift from the Lord. So there's no question that there's a kingdom principle there.
Yeah. So this is where I feel terrible when we get to this, that, we're over time, out of time, whatever. But this is probably the most important thing we should talk about. To Michael's point, we're entrusted with souls here. And, part of this home is providing, and this is when we're talking about not just the four walls, right? We're talking about the environment of the home. CapEx spending, yeah, we got to spend some money to have four walls, to have a place where they're safe, where they can come in. But there's so much more to a home than just a house. And that's the building on the inside. And there should be, resources devoted to the needs there of raising our children and making sure that they're, comfortable and safe. And, we've got to make some serious decisions when we come to our CapEx spending on how much we're willing to spend to educate our children secularly or support their, athletic aspirations versus what our spend is to grow them spiritually. And again, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not knocking if your kid plays ball and you do travel ball, and that's I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. What I am saying is, if a large portion of your discretionary income goes to chasing an athletic pursuit and little to no goes to helping their spiritual pursuits, I think we've probably got an imbalance there. And it's important that we understand that, in raising God's children, these souls we're entrusted with, that our home environments ought to be one where spiritual priorities, because it's God's house, are promoted above athletic or academic pursuits. And listen, you may have, Mozart as your child, or you may have the next, Pete Rose or Derek Jeter or Michael Jordan. That absolutely may be. But if you spend time improving the backyard to put a putting green in or a basketball court, and you haven't spent enough time on their heart with introducing them to Jesus, I think we've messed something up.
Pete Rose was an interesting choice there. It wasn't the first place I would have got, but
I'm from Cincinnati. Yeah, I mean,
sometimes the north of the river seeps out of it. We can't get, but yeah, 100% cosign all that. So, what are we trying to say in this hour that we've spent together this morning? Our housing is a big part of our financial budget, and first of all, are we choosing that level appropriately? Is what we're doing, does it really fit our budget? And secondly, do we recognize that it's God's house? And in my judgment, the only way that we can justify spending a quarter of God's resources on housing is if that house is God's house used for his purposes. Otherwise, I would shudder to think that I would tell my master that I'm spending a quarter of his resources that I've been entrusted with or more on a capital asset that he's getting no benefit out of. I mean, that's a really troubling idea. Hey God, I'm spending a quarter of your stuff on this house, but you're not getting any benefit out of it. That should give us some pause. On the other hand, if people are being served, if people are getting loved on, if children are being raised, if the kingdom is benefiting because of this asset that I own, to God be the glory.
Right. Yeah. That it's different if we're building a, use asset that is a sanctuary for hurting souls. That's in line. Remember, we talked about all these things. Are our goals in line with God's goals? And when those two goals are lined up, we're doing it right. When those two goals are opposed to one another, we've messed something up along the way. So again, just very, very quick recap of, it's important. Let's get our numbers right. More important, let's get our intent right. As with everything else, intent is always the most important place to start spiritually. What's our intent? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? And we'll make sure we get the numbers right along the way. Next class, debt.
I think that's a good place to go. That kind of comes part and parcel with our with this discussion. We've talked about mortgage and debt, and so is it okay to have that mortgage? That'd be a good conversation for next time.
Right. And the difference, we'll get into the difference between leverage and debt too. We mentioned that concept a little bit briefly. And then how debt is a robber of things. So
how it can affect the rest of our budget. Yeah, it's a good conversation.
So we'll spend our next discussion doing that. But thank you all for tuning in. Again, hit like, hit share, send us comments, DM, text messages. If there's something specific you'd like to cover, we'll be more than happy to get through it as we work our way through the budget. But hopefully this has been good for you. All the things that we talk about in all these lessons, and maybe we should say this more, but it's evolution, not a revolution. Don't have to get there tomorrow. Pray about it. Talk this stuff over with your spouse and make some decisions as to what one change you can make, how you can take one step toward getting better. If you'll do that every day, down the road, we'll be right where we want to
be. The angle of the sunlight through the window tells me that it's time for me to depart. and so I'm going to be getting out of here. I've enjoyed it as always, my friend.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Until next time. See you.